Good afternoon, everyone. We have an amazing panel of experimentation leaders from some pretty big companies, Atlassian, Whatnot, and Figma, and they're all current users of Statsig, so I will disclose that first. I've had the pleasure of working with these amazing individuals. I've watched them through their Statsig experience as they've gone through the evaluation, the onboarding, and the internal ramp-up at their respective companies. And I've had the joy of watching them be both delighted by Statsig, but I've also been on the receiving end of some feedback. But I will introduce them up to the stage, and I will ask you to please introduce yourself, your name, and who you are. And I did not give you any notes for this, but I would love to hear just one, what is the most underrated aspect of experimentation? So why don't we start with Dylan?
You didn't give me that question. You gave me all the other questions, but you didn't give me that question. My name is Dylan Lewis. Nice to meet you all. I work at Atlassian. Been doing experimentation since 2004, 2003, something like that. It's amazing to watch people have long conversations about 20 clicks. And then just diving in, and it's not worth it. And so it's just an amazing thing. So that was one thing that was surprising that I see every once in a while. So
awesome. I'll introduce the next guest, Olabode. Come join us.
Hi all, I'm Olabode Anise, Data Science Manager at Figma. And what was the question again, Tim, on the unexpected?
Most interesting aspect of experimentation.
I think it's
underrated. Most underrated aspect.
I think it's really just like helping people think through experiment design. I think it's like one of those really challenging things where you get to dive deep into someone's domain and help them try to understand how they can measure change. I know, it's really fun to me.
All right, awesome. Cool. Thank you. And then the next person, last but certainly not least, this is Jared from Whatnot.
Hey all, my name is Jared Bauman. I currently lead core machine learning and experimentation platform at Whatnot. Whatnot, for those of you that don't know, is the largest live stream shopping and fastest growing marketplace platform in the US.
Awesome.
Oh, then the question. I think one thing I love about experimentation is when, rather than just finding the effect that you're looking for, you actually find a relationship between two variables that you didn't know was there before. And so sometimes two things spike simultaneously and like, hey, there's actually this really cool connection that we hadn't thought about before.
Thank you very much for that. So during this panel, we are going to center on a theme, and this is sort of this is my favorite theme, which is basically how do you continue to build a data-driven culture within a company? Just from my experience, I've thought that there was a playbook and one way to do this, but when I go out in the real world and speak with prospective customers or data scientists who are trying to do this at their own companies, what I have personally learned is that everyone's experience is different, and you really have to mold the strategy to fit your specific company's culture and where they are at the stage. And so that is why I felt like this was better off as a panel discussion, and I hope that the more stories and anecdotes you hear can sort of really help you inform how you approach building a data-driven culture at your place. So I think we're going to be in for some great set of experiences here. I am going to start off with our first question, and this is on the topic of just being data-driven. So, as I've mentioned, being data-driven is probably more of a journey rather than a destination. If you ask anybody, do you want to be data-driven? Everyone says yes, and everyone says, are you data-driven? And everyone say yes, but it's like, it is a spectrum of how to get there. I would like to start at the very beginning. I would love to hear from the panel over what you think some of the earliest steps are and milestones, and which of these are actually prerequisites before you can even begin experimentation. Dylan?
Yeah. So I've been fortunate enough to be at two different companies that are very data-driven, and they start off with you heard Fiji today talk about looking at reports and being that in that amount of the data every single day and being able to bring things up for her employees. I've been fortunate enough to have big companies where those leaders are doing that same thing there as well. And so they're in there looking at the experiment results, they're finding out what's going on, what's not going on, they're operating the company from the dashboards, and that's, setting that example is required.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think in terms of like milestones, in terms of being data driven, like I've been at companies of varying sizes where maybe we didn't know what we should be caring about. And then once we got to kind of center around those particular like metrics or like actions that users were taking, like then saying, okay, like how do we capture that data reliably? Like what is our ETL and all that stuff, so that people can then have those dashboards that they can actually review and like actually check on a regular basis. I feel like those kind of things of like finding out what's important and being able to measure it like consistently is kind of like, those are like the prerequisites that I've seen at different companies.
Yeah, I might even go further back and talk about like actually having data and a data platform that you trust. If you do not trust the underlying infrastructure that you are building experimentation on top of, that can be a big risk, because then every time you try to ship something, you relitigate old discussions about, okay, is that metric trustworthy? But yes, but, right? You need to get rock solid foundation on data accuracy. And then I think in addition, like have those cultural aspects where things are kind of moving in the right direction. And
Thank you for bringing that one up, because we work with a lot of startups, and just assuming the assumption that everyone has data and that they trust it is probably incorrect. I think some folks don't even do the logging, and for folks who do the logging, it's sometimes just stashed in a warehouse and untouched. So I think really is a broad spectrum of folks. Of where folks can come from. Can we talk about a little bit about what do you think the biggest cultural challenges are in building a data-driven culture? Like who are I think I've heard from Ronnie this morning mention the term, this is the first time I heard this, cultural war. And so what are the enemies in a cultural war of building data?
the first thing that can kill you is if you don't have basically a high-level consensus on how you're going to use experiments, right? There are two different ways you can kind of think about experimentation in kind of a practical setting. There's kind of experimentation as a guardrail, right? We're still doing things that we think are right, but we are just checking to make sure that nothing is going off the cliff. And then there's like kind of what I would call like experimentation as arbiter, where like, hey, actually all of our decisions are metrics driven. This is what determines whether we ship a feature or not. And I think both of them have their place. I think at a smaller startup, you're typically going to be using some combination of those two in different fields, but you need to have high-level alignment on which of those paradigms you want to apply and where.
I think one of the pieces of this, as it relates to like the cultural war of like, again, how do we maybe, again, it goes back to using experimentation, but like, how are we going to consider it as a data point, and like, how are we driving like our product development? And so like, I think that was just said was about like, hey, are we going to use it as a guardrail or arbiter? But how do we mix that in with like user research? Because those are important stakeholders who are bringing important data points. Or even product developers, product managers who have this vision on like, who are talking to customers and understand what their needs are. And so I can think it can be about like, how do we like build alignment between all of these different data points to make decisions?
I think the other thing that's really important, we have a value at Atlassian called Open Company No Bullshit. OCMB, which is pretty amazing. And so having teams that are open to being wrong, many, many times wrong, is actually something that's really, really helpful. But people that are very closed off and siloed, it makes it really, really difficult for us to be able to make inroads to build up their data culture.
I want to double click on that one. I find experimentation to be the most humbling of like the most humbling experience as a data scientist. And do you have any advice on when you encounter somebody who believes very firmly in an opinion and they sort of either don't really internalize the data or just ignore it completely? What are the things you can recommend on how to work with such an individual?
You know, you have to bring them on board for experimentation. You have to figure out what it is that's going to make them tick, and what it is that's going to resonate with them. And that can be years in the making. So you get everybody else around them to do it, and then hopefully they come along at some point. So, but you do have staunch resistance in some places, and so you have to figure out how to navigate through that.
Anyone else have a comment on that one?
I don't know. I think a lot of it's around empathy. Like, I don't know, trying to put ourselves in maybe our stakeholders' shoes. Like, they have some incentives that they're trying to drive, and trying to kind of understand those and try to let them know that this can be like a win-win. Like, we can improve our experimentation culture, and you can like hit your goals or your milestones that you're trying to do. That's very difficult, and it's going to be easier with more people. But that's kind of what I've seen to be successful, at least in my career.
Yeah, I don't know if this is like particularly about this situation, but like generally, if you're having this conflict with someone because the experiment results didn't go their way, you got them involved way too late in the process, right? And so getting them on board at the earliest stages of like, yes, we're gonna run an experiment and then like we're gonna use this to inform our decision in XYZ, right? And getting that commitment before the actual experiment launches, I think can then make the after the fact conversations much easier.
I can tell you've been through this before. Yeah, that's good advice. We'll switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about the topic of build versus buy. This comes up a lot, especially when in all vendor tooling. I would like to know, number one, what triggers a company to begin such an evaluation? Like, is there some sort of event that happens, or is this eventually something that builds momentum? And the second one is, how should one approach this decision?
So I've been fortunate enough to help build multiple experimentation platforms. I would say never do that ever again. They're have come a long way. Statsig's amazing. There's other tools that are out there in the marketplace as well, and you don't have to build it yourself. But you do have to. When I think about it, it has to be customizable enough for our teams and for our systems. And so oftentimes there's a piece of or a wrapper around it in order to be able to make it so it actually fits for us. And so when we looked at tools, we had an internal team that was doing stuff, but it just made more sense for us to be able to build and then wrap around it. So.
Yeah, I think the decision point can come when like you're mostly trying to scale, or maybe running into like maybe some constraints around like the platform you're building today. I think one of the big things is like you have these maybe a team that's working on it, but maybe it's like, can we leverage those people to be working on other problems that are really important to the company if we were able to like acquire a platform that like fits into like our culture and satisfies our constraints. But yeah, I kind of agree that it makes sense to like not build. Maybe if you're trying to like prove out the experimentations work, maybe you can like build a randomization function just to like say, hey, experiments are good. But as you try to scale, it just kind of makes sense to try to like orient people around like the things that your company is trying to win with.
Yeah, in terms of like when to start thinking about these decisions, I like to think about like deploying a tool like Statsig or something similar as like putting on a pair of glasses, right? If you needed prescription lenses, without the glasses, you're going to see the giant brick wall in front of you, but you might miss the finer details. And I think that there comes a certain point in time where, oh my gosh, we're at the pace now where like multiple teams are shipping features simultaneously, and we can't just look at the week over week change and be like, yeah, that's because of X, right? When you have to start deconfounding those things, that's when I think experimentation really, really goes from being a luxury to an imperative. In terms of that core build versus buy discussion, yeah, you could build it yourself. 5 years ago, that was a very reasonable thing to think about. But now you have to think about, one, what is the real cost of doing it yourself? Especially when, essentially a company like Statsig like amortizes that cost over multiple clients, right? You don't need DoorDash and Airbnb and Lyft all building their own experimentation platforms. You have like one central repo where that R&D is done. That has natural economies of scale. And you also get the benefits of all that R&D on day one. You don't have to spend 4 years building the platform yourself to get to parity with what's already available there on the market.
Thank you for bringing that up. I do have a follow-up here. So usually when we talk to customers, they have a list of features they are looking for, and it's almost like a checklist or a scorecard, and they're trying to grade us on it. And that is sort of, I would put that as like, that's their expectations of what they would like. Then when they implement and actually start using Statsig at their companies, I've learned there are some unexpected benefits. Maybe on the aspect of cultural change that can occur. I was wondering if either any of you have sort of seen that or can speak to what those might be. Maybe I'll start with you, Olabode.
Yeah, in terms of like unexpected cultural changes, I think it's some of these things where it's like we didn't know that there was this maybe correlation or tie to these potential metrics where you're like And at Figma's case, like before we adopted Statsig, we didn't have this like automated metric computation. So data scientists were having to do this manual analysis. And so when you don't have this like centralized metrics repo, you're not having all of these metrics calculated. You're only focusing on the things that are maybe right in front of you. And so understanding that, hey, like my metric here is actually impacting this other team, and they should actually maybe involved in this surface area and how we experiment has been like one of the really nice unexpected cultural changes.
I think the other thing is actually getting the data in order. So we send in a lot of custom events into Statsig in order to be able to do that. We used to have data scientists doing that, and now we have data engineering taking over that particular role. And so getting our data house in order is one of those unintended benefits that we're experiencing right now, which is awesome.
The only other thing I would add is that like a tool like this can help further your transformation to a data-driven culture. And this is true whether you go with a provider like Statsig or whether you build it internally. But when you actually start building that muscle around experimentation, you can actually pivot from an objective-driven culture of, oh, I need to ship this feature, oh, I need to do Y, to a metrics-driven culture. My job as an engineer is to improve GMV. Shipping features is just a way to accomplish that. And I think you can then create a greater sense of ownership as a result of experimentation, because then you can actually tie back. It's not just that you ship the feature, it's that you ship the feature and it did X. And I think that actually aligns incentives a lot better.
Maybe to follow up on that, if you have a team of data scientists and they may or may not have been doing the experiment calculations manually, what are they doing after that has been automated onto a platform?
Yeah, I mean, diving deeper, right? You get the top level result for free, and now you can be like, okay, but now what are the subgroup impacts? Dimensional analysis is probably my favorite feature on Statsig, and I think it really helps to kind of like create extreme transparency and also a lot of trust within the organization. Because it's like, okay, it's not just that you saw this number and you can communicate it externally. You can be like, yeah, this happened, and here's why. This is the subgroup that moved.
I guess one thing I wanted to add on like unexpected culture changes, I think when you're adopting a platform, it can also highlight maybe areas in your process that need a little bit more attention. I've kind of seen this at many different places, but let's if you go from something that's like ad hoc to automated, like if you don't have maybe like a process of pre-registering experiment decisions, like, hey, if we see this metric move in this way, we're going to make this decision. When you have a list of metrics that are computed, you say, hey, you could cherry pick. And so like you can see some areas where you maybe need to like strengthen like your process and related to experimentation as well.
Thank you. Those are really good examples. I have personally seen having a data scientist sort of shift gears into more of the storytelling aspect can really drive home the insights that might have surfaced rather than just focusing on getting the computations correct. Okay, we're gonna talk about lessons learned. So you've all had experience building your company's data culture. What is one takeaway you would like to share with the audience? Well, maybe Dylan?
Yeah. So make it fun. That's I know it's silly, but it is. Yesterday we did a workshop, and I had stickers printed up and gave everybody stickers at the very end of the workshop, and everybody was super happy and left with a smile on their face, and it's just fun. It's a $50 expense that makes it so people actually enjoy the day. So you've heard about the hippo. We also ring a gong sometimes at my previous company when experiments launch. Just make it fun, make it enjoyable, make it so that people are excited to do the work.
Yeah, I guess on like data-driven culture and experimentation, I think it's like bringing more people in and maybe to the party or the fun that you're kind of mentioning. Like there are like user researchers, there are like behavioral scientists, obviously PMs and our stakeholders who want to be involved, and bringing them early and getting them excited about it. It's like really important. And especially because like on like the UXR or like the behavioral scientists, like they're generating data points as well, and they want to help bring about this data culture. So I just think it's important to like make as big of a tent as possible and bring folks in.
Yeah, I think I kind of already mentioned a little bit. It's like coming from the marketplace perspective. I think this ability to focus on metrics instead of features, I think is pretty transformative. That may not work in a Figma world, but in my world we have that luxury. And so that's really nice. The thing you have to be careful about if you are in a position where you can take that stance is then you need to make sure that there is space for failure. Because once the metric becomes like how everything is evaluated on, if you don't be like, hey, look, yeah, no, you're going to fall flat on your face on 30% of your KRs, people will stop taking risks. They will only kind of focus on the things that are sure bets and will kind of get you across the line just to keep everyone else happy. But that's not actually what you want engineers and product folks to be working on.
Okay. We have talked a lot about data-driven, and I think that has been the key theme of this conference. But I would like to know, where are the limits, and can you take it too far? And in particular, the debate that is sort of online is, how do you balance between being data and vision-led? Would love to hear any thoughts there. I will start with maybe Jared.
Okay, I'm going to say very little on this because as a marketplace, I think we can really go ham on being data-driven. Again, that is not a luxury that everyone has. You know, I think not all experimentation needs to go into that experiment as arbiter bucket, right? There's a lot of room for experimentation as guardrail, especially, you know, if you're looking at smaller populations, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there are very reasonable ways to do both.
Yeah, even outside of Figma, I've been really fortunate to, again, be at companies that had like a big product design and user research area where like they're kind of informed, like the data obviously tells you like what's happening, and like those other data points tell you like maybe why. And like infusing that as well as like product vision and strategy is just really important. So like I do think we can probably go too far, and I think it's important to, again, consider this as like a data point in your decision making, not maybe the sole one, depending on the service area. And I think that's just been really important, and like it has led to like deeper and like greater collaboration, and maybe less fear of things like experimentation.
I want to dive a little bit deeper on that, because Figma is a tool for designers, and I would assume there's a certain amount of design led or vision led. Number one, is that true? And then how do you blend in data?
Yeah, I think it's I've been at Figma for about 2.5 years, and so I definitely benefit from the people who came from before me to make sure that the company was very like hypothesis driven. And so, yes, there's definitely like ideas from our product leaders and our design leaders who are like very plugged into community, understanding the problems that people have. But it's like, okay, like if we believe that to be a thing that's going to maybe like drive a particular metric that's important to us, like how do we test those things and validate that that's something that we believe to be important? And so again, I think that's like the melding of like, hey, like we have these really good ideas. How do we test that this is actually going to drive the outcomes that we believe to be important?
Do you have designers are not necessarily like fluent, or they don't speak naturally in metrics. How do you get to a place where you can quantify what they care about?
Yeah, actually, I mean, maybe I'll push back a little bit on this, on designers. I think they're really plugged into trying to solve the user problem. And usually, like, in the companies that I've seen, they're like, hey, like, how do I quantify, like, how much of this is a pain point? Or, like, how do I understand, like, how much of this is going to be maybe change someone's workflow or how they're interacting with our product? So I think they're, like, I've been very fortunate to have designers who are, like, pretty, like, data literate and being able to work through that. And so they're always kind of like hungry to say like, okay, I'm thinking about changing this, or I think we might want to invest here. And it's like, what is the ultimate impact going to be? And like, do we have any, again, ideas on like what this outcome will be? But I think it's just maybe a general concept of people who have like coming from different backgrounds as it relates to data, and like meeting them where they are, helping them solve their problem and obviously the company's problem.
I was going to touch on that. The most successful experimenting teams that I've seen is where all the different people come together. So you've got the engineer, you've got the data scientist, the product manager, and the designer all sitting at the table, going through the experiments, and that's where some of the real magic happens. There is a dark side to experimentation, though, using experimentation for accounting, right? And so you just experiment every single time so that you know how you're performing in your particular goals. And so that's that dark side of going way too far, being too focused on the experiments themselves.
Does anyone else have other examples of going too far? No, it doesn't have to be at a place you've worked at, just you've heard about.
No, I think
no names.
What Dylan said is exactly right. Like, particularly when you combine that accounting with, a place where like you better hit your KRs, like it can do a lot of cultural damage.
Nothing to add for me.
Thank you. I think we have time for some questions from the audience.
Hi, my name is Ameya. I'm an engineering manager leading a team, and we're doing a rewrite of a flagship product right now. And so my idea of attending today's seminar was just trying to understand how to bring the data-driven culture into doing something like a flagship redesign. So I had a question for Jared, which is, when you're an engineering leader, right, and when you're trying to build experiment-based, data-driven based features or decisions that you're making in your in building a product like I'm working on. Excuse me. How do you convince your peers to actually budget that into your roadmap, or how are you budgeting that? And as well, when you're building the experiment, how much are you building into your product? Like, do you build the whole functioning product, or do you build only enough to get the data that you're looking for from the experiment?
Maybe kind of going to your first question a little bit more, just so I understand. When you talk about like budgeting, are you saying like, oh, to get the time to run an experiment before shipping it, or kind of what does budgeting mean in your world?
Budget to actually build, your features in such a way that you can conduct that experiment, right?
Got it.
Because the
Got it.
experiment means that you actually build something,
Yep.
and probably you're not going to end up utilizing it or shipping it.
Got it. So I think, tools like, Statsig SDK actually make it pretty easy to simply wrap the code that you're trying to execute in a feature flag. And then, it doesn't require too much additional work to set up the experimentation infrastructure. There's a previous investment that needs to be made in the data so that you trust it enough to make decisions on it. But assuming your data and your data platform's in a good place, the incremental cost associated with running an experiment versus not is pretty minimal. You have to wait a couple weeks to collect the data, but I really don't think that I need an additional engineer hour to get this done is like a good excuse to not run an experiment. So that'll kind of deal with the first part. And then to the second part of your question, like, I think you do test the full feature, right? Because oftentimes, like, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And if you're just kind of individually testing these things that together would make a great feature, you might see absolutely nothing if you're just, shipping an arm or a leg or a head, right? You kind of need the whole thing put together before it makes sense to run a test.
Hey guys, my name is Manish. I run experimentation for Microsoft Teams. I think Jared had a point that made me think of a question, but it's for all of you. What is your general philosophy on either governance or the check and balances between how to log? So on one end of the spectrum, anyone can log whatever they want. They can spell anything they want incorrectly. You have seven different events for the same actual click. On the other end, you run everything through a lot of governance and everything's really slow. So when you're at the scale that you guys are operating at, how do you balance all that stuff? Let's say you were going in and starting from scratch.
Atlassian, our whole goal is to make it so teams can work well together and can be operate by themselves independently. And one of the challenges with that is that they all independently log their own instrumentation. And so you might have 6 different ways to understand if somebody creates an issue in Jira, right? And so we're working through that, and we're figuring out how to make it so that we can take our existing data structures and make it into something that's more useful and have it be owned and governed. But it's not simple, it's not fast, it's not easy, and it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I definitely feel like at least on the logging side, but the metric side, I think as we gave data scientists like the ability to add metrics, we saw that, okay, we were having people create a similar concept, maybe named differently, and having that visibility made it a lot easier to understand, hey, like maybe we can consolidate here. But I think it's really around like how do you allow people to move really quickly and not like block their work, but maybe they have the like ability to understand that like something's already existing that I can leverage. And maybe understanding if it like fits their needs. So we're still like, it's a journey. I'm still working on this, and like there's something that we do to try to like cull like these like duplicate events. But yeah, just trying to make it easy for people to understand what they can reuse versus having to create themselves.
Yeah, I think you guys have a new product, which I think is like the ad hoc metrics that you can do. That's the local metrics. I forgot exactly what it was called. But like now you actually have a world where you actually can tighten governance around the metrics that you're able to add to experiment, but that doesn't stop people from also adding an ad hoc metric when they actually need something, and then they can request that it be, upgraded later, right? So I think at least, there are ways to kind of like square the circle here.
Hi, my name is Julian from a software engineer at Atlassian. I had a question regarding, have any of you hit a situation where you run an experiment, the metrics look great, you're like, this is a total ship, but maybe midway through, you have leadership come and say, oh wait, we can't ship this at all. Maybe fundamentally the design or something is not something that they foresee in the vision of the product. How did you handle this situation if you did come across that problem in your careers?
I did what I was supposed to do, and I didn't ship that feature. But I also got more data around it. And considered it and brought it up, and eventually we didn't ship it. So we had some really surprising results for an experiment. We ran it 3 times, and it was amazing what it did for the business. But we ended up not shipping it because of what it could do to how people thought about the company.
Yeah, and sometimes leadership is right on these things, right? Like, it is not just about the data. There are multiple things that you need to consider, right? It could be that, like, in the marketplace context, hey, we've shipped a lot of things that hurt our merchants, or in my DoorDash days, like Dashers lately. We don't want to do another one of these. Like, that's a very reasonable reason to override naively the data in the box.
Yeah, I guess in cases like this, yeah, I think leadership can pose questions, and then it maybe like allows or forces you to dive deeper into the data that you have available to answer their questions. And in some of those cases where leadership is right and we're going to make this decision, it is like Ronnie's saying about like, hey, maybe we should have these as guardrail metrics for how we ship something. But yeah, sometimes there's a little bit of tension there because you're saying, hey, like what we thought was right, and we kind of were able to prove that through the experiment, maybe just didn't end up with our result.
We are at time, but I was wondering, could we get a round of applause for this amazing panel?